August 4, 2020, Bradenton, Florida. In the muggy evening heat, players from the Atlanta Dream step off their bus wearing matching black t-shirts. Emblazoned across each shirt in big block letters are two words that have nothing to do with basketball: Vote Warnock. The Dream are about to play a game, but their shirts carry the name of Raphael Warnock, the man campaigning to unseat their team's co-owner, Senator Kelly Loeffler. As the players stride into the arena, cameras capture the unprecedented sight. An entire roster of professional athletes is openly opposing the person who signs their paychecks. It's a bold, risky stand, one that will reverberate far beyond this one summer night. The road to this moment was years in the making. The Women's National Basketball Association tipped off in 1997 to both excitement and skepticism. Early on, crowds packed arenas to see stars like Lisa Leslie and Cynthia Cooper, but a chorus of critics was never far behind. When the WNBA's rival women's league, the ABL, went bankrupt in 1999, doomsdayers insisted the new WNBA would be next. And indeed, the league soon hit growing pains. After the 2002 season, the NBA pulled back its financial support, two teams folded, and pundits once again proclaimed the end was near. But the WNBA survived. By its 10th anniversary, it had become the first women's team sports league to last a full decade in America. Still, simply staying alive didn't silence the naysayers. Every step of the way, loud voices mocked the WNBA's game and its business. Talk radio hosts joked that nobody watches women's basketball. Whenever players advocated for better pay or resources, online trolls spat back that the league should be grateful it exists at all. In short, disrespect was constant, but it only steeled the resolve of the women on the court. By the mid-2010s, WNBA players were developing a new kind of legacy, one even their harshest critics couldn't ignore: activism. These athletes saw social issues affecting their own lives and communities, and they weren't content to stick to sports. One defining moment came in July 2016. Following the police killings of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling and the murder of 5 police officers in Dallas, the Lynx team organized a pregame protest. They donned black warm-up shirts reading "Black Lives Matter," along with the names of the slain men and a Dallas police badge in tribute to the fallen officers. At a press conference, Lynx players spoke about ending racial profiling and violence. It was a courageous stand at a time when few athletes, male or female, were speaking so pointedly about police brutality.
The backlash was immediate. 4 off-duty Minneapolis police officers who had been working security at the Lynx Arena walked off the job in protest. The head of the local police union publicly blasted the players as anti-police and told them they are professional athletes. Stick with playing ball. People go there to watch the basketball game. In other words, shut up and dribble. The message from some in law enforcement and segments of the public was clear. Even as unarmed Black Americans were shot and protests roiled the nation, these women were expected to stay silent and entertain. The WNBA itself initially seemed to agree. Later that month, players on several teams who wore similar black protest shirts during warm-ups were hit with fines for violating the league's uniform policy. Instead of backing down, the players unified. They wore plain black shirts to post-game press conferences, refusing to talk about basketball. Under mounting public pressure, even NBA superstar Carmelo Anthony spoke out against the penalties. The league was forced to rescind the fines a few days later. WNBA President Lisa Borders acknowledged the players' right to express themselves, and teams even held unity nights to foster dialogue. It was a small victory, but an important one. The players of the WNBA had discovered their collective voice, and they weren't about to give it up. Fast forward to 2020. The stakes for speaking out had only grown. The year brought a convergence of crises: a devastating pandemic, an economic downturn, and a nationwide reckoning over racial injustice after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. By now, many WNBA players were seasoned activists in their own right. Some had marched in protests, others had personal connections to the issues. Roughly 70% of the league's players are black women, so the fight for racial justice hit close to home. Even one of the WNBA's brightest stars, Maya Moore, had stepped away from basketball entirely in 2019 to focus on criminal justice reform, helping free a man wrongly imprisoned for over 20 years. This was the identity the WNBA was forging, not just a sports league, but a force for social change.
So, when the WNBA's 2020 season arrived, in the shadow of unprecedented turmoil, the league took a decisive stance. The season was shortened and held in a quarantined bubble environment, nicknamed the Wubble, at IMG Academy in Florida due to COVID-19. From the outset, the WNBA and its players' union agreed to dedicate the year to social justice. Courts were painted with the words Black Lives Matter. Players would wear warm-up jerseys emblazoned with Black Lives Matter on the front and Say Her Name on the back, honoring victims of racial violence like Breonna Taylor. Before the first tip-off, WNBA players collectively announced that the 2020 season would be played in the memory of women like Taylor and in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. In essence, the league was proudly declaring its values: equality, justice, and the power of women's voices. It was a bold move, and not everyone was happy about it. Enter Kelly Loeffler. At the time, Loeffler was a newly appointed U.S. Senator from Georgia and, importantly, a co-owner of the WNBA's Atlanta Dream franchise. She was also a vocal conservative in the midst of a tough election campaign. From the beginning, Loeffler made it clear she did not approve of the league's embrace of Black Lives Matter. On June 24, 2020, even before the WNBA season began, she went on Fox News to denounce BLM as a very divisive and dangerous movement. A couple of weeks later, she doubled down in writing. In early July, Loeffler sent a letter to WNBA Commissioner Kathy Engelbert objecting to the league's social justice initiatives. She urged the WNBA to drop the Black Lives Matter campaign, arguing that politics should be kept out of sports. In the letter, Loeffler described Black Lives Matter as a political movement that she claimed was misaligned with the values and goals of the WNBA and the Atlanta Dream. Instead, she proposed teams should put an American flag on every jersey, a common-sense show of unity, in her view. The implication was that the WNBA's support for racial justice was unpatriotic and alienating to fans.
Loeffler's very public rebuke of the league she partially owned landed like a lightning bolt. Almost immediately, a firestorm erupted. WNBA players, past and present, unleashed their feelings on social media and in interviews. The WNBA Players Association's official Twitter account responded with one strident message aimed at Loeffler. Quote, ENOUGH, OUT, effectively spelling out enough, out, for the world to see. Players across the league began openly calling for Loeffler to be removed. Los Angeles Sparks forward Candace Parker spoke for many when she flatly said on TNT, "There's no place in the league for her." Some athletes suggested that if Loeffler couldn't support the basic humanity of her players, she should sell her stake in the team. Fans, and even a few of the Dream's sponsors, voiced their disapproval as well. Sensing the growing outrage, the WNBA released a statement to distance itself from Loeffler's remarks, emphasizing that she was no longer involved in the day-to-day operations of the Dream. But that was as far as league officials were willing to go. Removing an owner is no simple matter, and Loeffler remained in her co-owner seat, now openly at odds with virtually every player in her league. If Loeffler was fazed by the backlash, she didn't show it. Instead, she seemed to relish her new role as a victim of so-called cancel culture. Appearing on conservative media, Loeffler portrayed herself as a defender of sports against politics. She warned that the WNBA was making a mistake by aligning with Black Lives Matter, and she accused the players of intolerance toward opposing views. This is just more proof that the out-of-control cancel culture wants to shut out anyone who disagrees with them, Loeffler said after seeing the criticism she faced. It's clear that the league is more concerned with playing politics than basketball.
She insisted she would not apologize for her beliefs and stood by everything she wrote. To many WNBA players, these words were infuriating, but also telling. They saw that Loeffler was effectively using the controversy to boost her own political profile. As a Republican senator running in a special election, Loeffler was appealing to a segment of Georgia voters who might share her disdain for Black Lives Matter. The more the players fought her, the more she dug in and painted herself as a bold truth-teller under attack by woke athletes. It was, as Seattle Storm star Sue Bird later observed, a perverse dynamic. The more we fight her, the more it was just playing into her hands, Bird said. Loeffler was happy to pose as the embattled owner being silenced by political correctness. Keep politics out of sports, Loeffler would say, while simultaneously using sports as a political pawn for her own gain. The irony wasn't lost on the players.
By late July 2020, the confrontation between Kelly Loeffler and the WNBA players had reached a stalemate. The Senator owner refused to back down, and the league, bound by ownership rules, refused to push her out. The Atlanta Dream players were in an especially painful position. This was their team owner disparaging a movement that they, and the majority of their league, wholeheartedly supported. It was kind of disappointing, kind of sad to learn something like that, Dream guard Tiffany Hayes said of Loeffler's stance, and I knew right away that I wasn't with it. Inside the Wubble, the Dream squad held emotional team meetings over Zoom. Newer players were stunned that they had signed with a franchise now mired in such controversy. Veteran leaders like Elizabeth Williams tried to keep the team unified and focused. Across the league, players and union leaders strategized about how to respond next. Initially, many were still calling for Commissioner Engelbert to remove Loeffler or force a sale of the team. But as the summer wore on, WNBA players began to consider a different approach. Sue Bird, one of the league's elder stateswomen at 39 and a four-time champion, was among those contemplating the bigger picture. Bird and others realized that every day they spent talking about Kelly Loeffler was a day Loeffler controlled the narrative. The players wanted to fight back, but fighting on Loeffler's terms felt like a losing battle. It was like, oh shit, Bird recalled, describing the light bulb moment when it became clear that directly attacking Loeffler might be counterproductive. She got to show the state of Georgia. Oh, look at me, I am standing up to these people. It was ironic that this woman was saying, keep politics out of sports, when she was actually using us as a political pawn. In other words, Loeffler wanted the fight. So the players decided to stop fighting her and instead throw their energy behind someone else entirely.
That someone was Reverend Raphael Warnock. Warnock was one of several candidates running against Loeffler in Georgia's upcoming Senate race, a black pastor from Atlanta with a platform of civil rights and healthcare reform. Before the summer, few outside Georgia knew his name. Even within Georgia, Warnock was polling in the single digits. But to the WNBA players, he represented the antithesis of Kelly Loeffler. He supported Black Lives Matter and the broader social justice causes that the players cherished. What if, the players reasoned, they could boost Warnock's visibility while sending a message to their owner? Two birds, one stone, champion their values and spite Loeffler at the same time. The idea started circulating in late July. The WNBA Players Union even consulted with voting rights advocate Stacey Abrams, who sat on the union's board of advocates, to vet Warnock as a candidate. Abrams assured them that Warnock was the real deal. In Zoom meetings involving players across the league, the consensus grew that Warnock deserved their support. He supported all the things that we supported, so once players liked him, we were like, how do we show our support? Forward Elizabeth Williams said. That's when Sue Bird had her next bold idea. The concept was simple but unheard of. WNBA players would wear t-shirts endorsing Raphael Warnock during their official pregame warm-ups on national television. It would be a direct and very public thumb in the eye to Kelly Loeffler without ever even saying her name. When Bird first floated the t-shirt plan, even some of her comrades were shocked.
Bird texted Renee Montgomery, the Dream's star point guard, who had opted out of the season to focus on social justice work. "So the shirts are going to say what now?" Montgomery replied, incredulously. Bird's answer? "Vote Warnock." Montgomery couldn't help but smile. "Whoa, that is big. That is lit," she said, using slang for exciting once the idea sunk in. Still, everyone understood the gravity of what they were proposing. We're not talking about just going against maybe a sponsor.
"We're literally talking about a team owner," Montgomery later explained of her initial hesitation. The power dynamics were real. Kelly Loeffler was wealthy, well-connected, and not someone used to being defied by her employees. There was an unspoken fear that speaking out might invite retribution. Lost roster spots, blackballing, who knew? But the players' conviction outweighed their fear. As Williams put it, they wanted to be intentional about their words and actions, and to stand strong as professional athletes who use our voices off the court. By early August, the plan was set. Every team in the league was informed in the player-only channels. Dozens of Vote Warnock shirts were printed in secrecy and shipped to the WNBA bubble. The stage was nearly ready for the ultimate statement. On the night of August 4th, 2020, that statement unfolded for all to see. Players from the Atlanta Dream, Seattle Storm, Chicago Sky, and Phoenix Mercury arrived at the IMG Academy Gym in Bradenton, Florida, site of that evening's games, wearing the now infamous black t-shirts with Vote Warnock emblazoned across the chest. The normally routine pre-game walk from the team bus became a deliberate photo opportunity. Cameras clicked and zoomed in on the slogan. Announcers and viewers at home immediately understood the significance. The WNBA was effectively campaigning against one of its own owners. At the arena, players socially distanced and warmed up as usual, all while advertising Raphael Warnock's name in unison. No one had ever seen anything quite like it. This wasn't a team rebellion, it was a league-wide revolution. The women of the WNBA, from superstars like Sue Bird and Diana Taurasi to the entire Atlanta Dream roster, were sending a singular message. If Kelly Loeffler wouldn't listen to them, maybe Senator Loeffler would listen to the voters. It was a massive gamble, with stakes that reached beyond sports. These players were willing to risk their comfort, their relationships with ownership, perhaps even their careers, in order to stand up for their beliefs. They had made their move in spectacular fashion. Now, all they could do was wait to see if it would make a difference.
The effect showed up first in the data no one in basketball used to watch. Donation ledgers, search trends, and a graph line sprinting north. Within hours of the shirts appearing on national television, Raphael Warnock's campaign reported a surge of small-dollar contributions and a spike in traffic so sharp it looked like a vertical wall. Reporters phoned to ask what had changed. The answer was simple enough to fit on cotton. The shirts had carried a name into living rooms that had mostly never heard it. The WNBA had converted a news cycle that once revolved around a senator scolding their league into a story about a largely unknown pastor with a chance to flip a seat. If Kelly Loeffler had been counting on fatigue to quiet the players, the opposite happened. The controversy gave the athletes a stage. The shirts gave the public a new protagonist. They used their power, Warnock said in a brief interview that week, and I am grateful. And then he moved on to talking about healthcare and jobs, leaving the rest unsaid. But shirts and headlines don't win elections by themselves. What the players did next pushed the clash off the court and into the most tangible terrain in American life. Who shows up to vote? The Social Justice Council that the league and its union had created that summer became a command center for civics work. Players recorded videos explaining Georgia's voter registration deadlines and how to request a mail ballot. They partnered with nonpartisan groups to host virtual town halls from hotel rooms in the Florida bubble. The Dream roster, stuck in the strangest season of their careers, seemed to move in the daylight and on the timeline of a campaign war room, texting relatives, amplifying hotline numbers, and answering questions from fans who had never before considered calling their county registrar. Through it all, the criticism kept coming. Commentators on cable segments rolled their eyes and asked who these athletes thought they were. The replies appeared in the form of registrations submitted and early vote lines that snaked around Georgia buildings. Every attempt to shove these women back into a narrow lane only widened the highway in front of them.
When, on August 26th, a different kind of line broke everything open. In Kenosha, Wisconsin, police shot Jacob Blake 7 times in the back, and the shock reverberated across every locker room in America. The Milwaukee Bucks refused to play their NBA playoff game. In the WNBA bubble that same evening, players from the Washington Mystics arrived wearing white shirts with 7 painted bullet holes on the back. They huddled together at center court. The decision spread team to team. There would be no games that night. Some athletes cried, others stood with their arms folded tight as if holding themselves together could keep the world from splitting. "We're not just here to entertain," said guard Laisha Clarendon, then serving on the Social Justice Council, and there was no witty retort left for anyone who had said otherwise. The air around the league changed. It became impossible to pretend that politics and sports were separate planets when the people in uniform were bleeding from the same gravity. The stoppage, brief but seismic, forced another round of the same counter-argument the players had been hearing for years. Stick to sports. Ratings will suffer. Fans will flee. But the effect again ran in reverse. The choice to skip games was covered by every outlet that normally kept the WNBA to a crawl at the bottom of the ticker. The images, linked arms, shirts with bullet holes, a season rebranded around memory and justice supplanted 1,000 lazy punchlines. When play resumed, the intensity felt different, not as an escape from the world, but as a continuation of the same insistence. Our lives matter. Our voices count. If critics heard shrillness, their ears were tilted toward the past. The sound on the court was resolve. Election season arrived like a monsoon. November 3rd, 2020. Across Georgia, precincts reported heavy turnout. Across the nation, tensions tunneled from television screens into living rooms. The WNBA's players had finished their shortened season by then, but they hadn't finished their work. Hours before polls closed, Dream players were still pushing information to followers about how to cure a ballot rejected for a signature issue, or where to find a drop box in counties that had moved locations at the last minute. When results trickled in, Georgia's special Senate race snapped into a runoff. No candidate had cleared 50%. For most states, a runoff is a procedural footnote. In Georgia, it meant 2 months that would decide the balance of power in Washington. The only thing more improbable than a sports league helping launch a Senate candidate was that those same athletes were now staring down a rematch with their own team's co-owner in a race that had grown to historic stakes. In those weeks, the WNBA split the difference between postseason and preseason and found a new gear. More videos, more Zooms, a steady cadence of short messages that made the procedural sound personal. "Your ballot is your voice," said Senator Elizabeth Williams, plain and steady as if explaining a defensive rotation. "Use it." Former players stepped into the chorus. Renee Montgomery, who had sat out the 2020 season to focus on social justice, became one of the most visible voices in the state, hosting conversations, pushing logistics, standing as proof that stepping away from the game could be a step toward something larger. The counter voices stayed loud. Talking heads laughed at the idea that a women's basketball league could sway anything. Their laughter echoed into microphones that carried the players' message farther. Opponents called it shameless politics in jerseys. The players shrugged and kept dialing. Every insult that landed on their timelines hardened into a simple equation. If ridicule was the cost of visibility, pay it and move.
January 5, 2021. Georgia's runoff election. The day began with fog in Savannah and a crimson sunrise in Atlanta. Small details that seemed to matter when everything felt like it might spin apart. Warnock cast his ballot early. Loeffler toured polling places with cameras in tow. By nightfall, the entire country was watching one state's vote tally. In a campaign newsroom in Atlanta, staffers checked the graph lines like medics reading a heart monitor. In living rooms and apartments, WNBA players texted each other screenshots and prayed their phone batteries would hold out. When metro Atlantic counties reported more tranches of votes, Warnock's lead widened. Just after midnight, he declared victory. By morning, the networks had followed. The margin landed at just over 2 points. In other words, close enough for every conversation in a hotel hallway to matter. What happened next turned the feud into a parable. Loeffler's political career in the Senate ended not with a concession on policy, but with a concession speech after losing to a candidate whose name the WNBA had worn across their chests. In February, the league approved a sale of the dream to a new ownership group. The senator who had urged the league to distance itself from Black Lives Matter was out. One of the new co-owners was Renee Montgomery, a former Dream Guard who had opted out to work on voting rights and had cheered the shirts from outside the bubble. A player had crossed the velvet rope into the owner's suite. In press photos, she stood grinning beside civic leaders turned business partners, proof that the door critics had tried to slam shut now swung the other way. "Dream bigger," Montgomery said once, and it felt like less of a slogan than a dare to keep going.
The climax might have ended there, shirts to votes to a defeated critic to a transformed franchise. But the arc of cause and effect stretched further. By taking heat and refusing to disappear, the players had drawn new attention to old issues inside their own house. A year earlier, the union had negotiated a new collective bargaining agreement that raised top salaries and provided improved maternity benefits and travel protections. Now, every public debate about pay equity poured fresh fuel into those negotiations' next phases. The phrase, "revenue, not charity," became a kind of mantra in interviews as players insisted on being treated as partners in a business rather than recipients of benevolence. When detractors dragged out the old comparison to NBA salaries, the players countered with the same steady refrain: match investment to expectation, and then we'll see. The more the criticism repeated itself, the less it sounded like an argument, and the more it sounded like a challenge the league was increasingly willing to meet. Growth rarely works like a chart in a brochure: steady, diagonal, untroubled. The WNBA's post-2020 years looked like real life. Uneven gains, sudden accelerations, and flare-ups that doubled as inflection points. Charter travel went from a whispered complaint to a policy with a timeline. Attendance and viewership numbers climbed, then leapt as a wave of new stars arrived from record-shattering college careers. With them came a new cycle of commentary. The league's loudest doubters resurfaced to predict that spikes would fade, to insist that the surge was a fad tethered to a single rookie, to reduce years of work to a month of headlines. The players simply did what they had done in 2016 and 2020. They answered by playing and organizing. Veterans guarded the league's culture while inviting new fans in. Rookies took questions and opportunities, and sometimes the hits, and then turned those into full arenas in cities that had not sold out in years. In the push and pull, a pattern reappeared. The volume of the criticism correlated with the size of the audience hearing the reply.
The backlash around social activism never truly vanished. It evolved. In the summer of 2022, as Brittany Griner, Phoenix Mercury center and two-time Olympian, was detained in Russia, the league was forced into the most delicate and wrenching advocacy it had ever attempted. Security experts advised a soft public posture. Teammates and players across the league balanced public pressure with behind-the-scenes lobbying. Opponents and online trolls recycled the same two lines they had been using for years: "Keep quiet and no one cares." But the silence they were demanding would have meant abandoning one of their own. The league and union formed a coordinated support effort, magnifying calls for her release when it was deemed helpful and holding back when the back channel indicated that noise might complicate negotiations. In December 2022, when Griner returned in a prisoner swap, WNBA players welcomed her home with the weariness of people who had held their breath for 10 months. Critics mocked the complexity of the deal. The athletes turned the conversation back to a teammate's life. The message was the same one they had sharpened across a decade. There are moments when sport is the loudest microphone for a fundamentally human point. If that sounded abstract, the next seasons made it concrete. There were nights when a young guard hit a logo three to cap a comeback, and the building shook in a way that had once seemed reserved for other leagues. There were nights when a rookie's jersey sold out in hours, and the token sellers who joked that nobody watched women's basketball suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of inventory.
There were entire weeks when hired talkers tried to turn hard fouls into morality plays and were met with a film session's worth of context from players who had been wrapped in ice after back-to-backs in mid-July heat. "It's a grown woman's league," a veteran forward said after one such game, "and we protect each other." And that was that. The cycle repeated, but with a twist. What at once felt like a debate over the league's existence began to look like a debate conducted on the league's terms. The WNBA was not hovering at the edge of survival. It was drawing lines around where it would invest, how it would expand, and when it would remind a national audience that the sport's speed and geometry belonged to a library of its own.
None of this erased the memory of those early voices saying the league would fold by year 10. Instead, it reframed them as the foil in a story that now stretched across generations. The skepticism did not vanish. It lost its mystique. Each time a ratings graphic popped up after a high-stakes game, the league acquired a new reference point. Each time a collective action, fines rescinded after a protest, a game postponed for a human reason, a senator unseated by a shirts-turned-billboard strategy, succeeded, the idea that players should stick to sports sounded less like a rule and more like nostalgia for a world that never really existed. Younger athletes arriving from dominant college programs stepped into a professional culture already inoculated against the old belittlements. They had seen what the league had done with its loudest critics, transform their barbs into clarifying moments, pressure into visibility, and conflict into leverage. The owners who chose to pay attention learned the lesson too. Investment did not come from scolding a league into quiet. Investment followed a product that announced itself with confidence and a workforce that did not conflate gratitude with silence. The fans learned along with them. Crowds that once drowned in skepticism picked up the drumbeat of the league's specific virtues, defensive rotations that snap like traps closing, post moves that grind a defender into the stanchion, guards who relocate with the economy of a metronome switching tempos. The story expanded from resistance to craft. Critics still talked. The games filled the room.
There were setbacks that critics pointed to as if they were endings, collective bargaining sessions that took longer than expected, disputes over travel policy, facility issues that arrived like potholes in the spring. Players, already fluent in navigating pressure, did what professionals do. They fixed what they could and made noise about what they could not. The league owned its public growing pains instead of papering over them, and in doing so, it modeled something rare in sports: transparency without self-immolation. Even the discourse about pay, exhausting as it sometimes became, functioned as a kind of public seminar in sports economics. Fans learned the difference between revenue and valuation, between salary caps and operational budgets, between cash compensation and marketing deals. In pressers that used to center on shot volume and matchups, players explained why maternity benefits matter, why charter flights aren't luxuries but competitive balance measures, why the gap between potential and present tense is the difference between a 2-hour midweek slot and a primetime showcase. A decade earlier, those explanations would have been ridiculed as excuses. Now they read as a roadmap. The league's identity hardened in the face of that scrutiny. It was no longer only the place where the best women's basketball players in the world competed. It was the place where the best women's basketball players in the world insisted that the sport belonged fully to them and to the people who cared enough to watch. That insistence drew allies from places the critics had not anticipated. Sponsors discovered that an association with the WNBA came with both the heat of the conversation and the loyalty of a fan base that understood what it meant to stake out a position. Broadcasters learned to explain the game with the attention it deserved, pulling in viewers who were tired of being told to adjust their expectations downward. City governments learned that a home playoff berth could needle economic indicators in neighborhoods where summer had long been a lull. There were still nights when the league pushed uphill against habit, but the path was no longer the lonely incline of survival. It was the upward curve of momentum.
Late in one season, well after the dream had changed hands and the shirts had become museum pieces, a small moment captured the new order. A girl, 12, maybe 13, stood in a team store in a visiting arena, clutching 2 jerseys and biting her lower lip with the kind of focus usually reserved for possessions with 10 seconds left. Her father, a man who admitted he'd first come because his daughter had begged, asked which one she wanted. She shook her head and said she was buying the home player's jersey for herself and the visiting stars for her friend back home who had fallen in love with the game over the last 2 summers. Then she added, in a voice loud enough for the clerk to hear, that she and her friend were going to try out for the school team and learn how to run a 5-out offense because that's how they do it here. Critics who insisted no one watched now competed with the evidence of a memory being formed. The legacy the league wanted most, habit, routine, a culture that transmits itself forward, was no longer hypothetical. The aftershocks of 2020 still ripple through conversations about the WNBA's place in the American sports landscape. When someone demands politics be removed from the game, they are inadvertently endorsing the league's thesis that women's basketball has always existed at the intersection of talent, labor, and citizenship. When someone scoffs that a surge in attention revolves around 1 or 2 stars, they are confessing that they have not watched enough to recognize how many players have carved the league into what it is. When someone claims that conflict damages the product, they are ignoring the way conflict forged the league's modern identity. The loudest critics believe they could win by wearing down the athlete's patience. Instead, the athletes learn to turn the friction into forward motion.
This, in the end, is the legacy built by the shouting. In 2016, a handful of players risked fines to say 3 words and a promise: Black Lives Matter. In 2020, an entire league risked its comfort to say 3 different words and a play-in: Vote Raphael Warnock. Those moments weren't departures from sport, they were continuations of what basketball at its best demands: communication, trust, and a refusal to lose the possession. The WNBA absorbed the blows, mapped the angles, and played through contact. The results were not just moral victories or symbolic gestures, they were outcomes you could chart on a timeline. Fines rescinded and replaced with dialogue, a wildcat stoppage that forced a reckoning, a Senate seat flipped, a franchise pried from the grip of a critic and placed into the hands of a former player. A league that now speaks with ease about its worth because it has argued it publicly and won. There will be another round of criticism next season. There always is. It will be dressed in fresh clothing, couched in new misgivings about ratings or rules or rookies. The arguments will sound both familiar and slightly out of date. The players will nod politely, if at all, and then continue to do what they've done since the league's beginning: contest every loose ball, tell the truth about their lives, and invite anyone listening to bring their skepticism to a game and see what happens. This is not a fairy tale about harmony. It is a field report from a league that has learned to metabolize resistance into substance. The shirts were a tactic. The culture is the point.
The story began with a question. Could a team of WNBA players take down a sitting U.S. senator? The answer lives in the record, but the larger answer, the one that matters more than any single race, is that the attempt itself altered the arc of the league. The WNBA discovered that its strongest legacy would not be built in quiet rooms where doubts dictate limits. It would be built in the open, where the noise is loudest, the stakes are highest, and the people who are supposed to be grateful learn instead to be great. In that open, the game clarifies. A pass thrown into traffic becomes a layup. A slogan becomes a turnout operation. A critic becomes an accelerant. And a league becomes what it was always capable of being. Not a guest in someone else's sports universe, but a home with a front door it holds open for the future. When the final horn sounds on some far-off season, the box score for this era won't only list points, rebounds, and assists. It will list something like the number of days a player spent mentoring a teenager between games, or the number of times a roster chose to be human first and professional second. It will count the voter registrations generated by a social post as carefully as a steal that sparked a fast break. It will tally the nights when travel policies improved by inches because athletes refused to pretend the cost of fatigue was acceptable. It will mark down that once a senator tried to define the league's values from the outside. And the players replied by speaking for themselves and then proving, election by election, conversation by conversation, that the people had heard them. History will show that the loudest critics worked unwittingly on the league's behalf, supplying the external pressure required to crystallize identity.
And if there is one image that endures beyond the numbers, a single frame to play on the video board of memory, it might be this. August 2020, a wide tunnel in Florida humming with fluorescent light, a line of athletes stepping off a bus with their back straight and their eyes forward, wearing shirts that risked everything at once. They walk past the camera and into the arena where a game waits, and beyond it, a harvest of consequences. Critics will watch and talk. Voters will watch and act. Years later, an owner will look at an old photograph and understand that a door opened that night. The league will look back and call it courage. And the next generation will look forward and call it normal.